Well, welcome to the Ancient Artifacts. I'm Doug Powell, and it has been a little bit since we've done a podcast, but there has been all sorts of life that's happened between the last time and this time. But we're coming back with a guest that I am really excited about having and been pursuing for a while. And we're going to be talking to Daniel Wallace. He is the senior research professor of New Testament studies at Dallas Theological Seminary. And even more interesting, as far as I'm concerned, for today's podcast, he's the executive director of the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. And I think if I could purge the vast amount of rock trivia from my head and get back that space, I'd want to fill it with pretty much anything I could learn from Dan Wallace. So after reading his work and seeing him speak a number of times, he ended up becoming the inspiration for the protagonist in the series of novels that I'm in the midst of. And so this is a real privilege for me. He's not only an expert in biblical Greek, but he's an expert in textual criticism and an expert in the digitizing of biblical manuscripts. So thanks for coming on.
Gee, with an introduction like that, I can hardly wait to hear what I have to say.
Well, I have notes I can share with you. Well, well, let's just start with this. There's so many things that I want to talk about, but it's really hard to figure out where to start. But let's start with just what is the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, and how did it come about?
Well, I want to give the audience an easy way to remember that mouthful. If everybody knows who C.S. Lewis is, they have the first two initials. It's CSNTM. And that's our website, csntm.org. If you know who C.S. Lewis is, you have the first two initials down. And if you've ever watched The Wizard of Oz, you know who Auntie M is, CS Auntie M. And now it's going to be stuck in your memory in a really trivial way to do it, but that's the easiest way to remember this.
Except she was in Texas. I mean, she was in Kansas and you're in Texas.
Yeah, right. But still, it's CSNTM. You get the idea.
Yeah.
So yeah. I founded this institute. It's a nonprofit, non-confessional institute that I started 20 years ago. And we now have, I think, 7 full-time employees. It started as a summer project, really, to go to various sites throughout the world. And we really try to go for a 3-week trip to someplace in the world that had ancient handwritten Greek New Testament manuscripts, and we would digitize those. We started with state-of-the-art 4 and 5 megapixel cameras, and now we're up to 150 megapixel cameras. It was back then, it was, any iPhone, any cell phone is going to do a whole lot better pictures than what we had to start with, but it was still a good start. And in the process, I think we've digitized well over 700 manuscripts. And we have on our website links to another 1,000+ manuscripts. Of the Greek New Testament manuscripts that exist today, there's about 5,500 of them, approximately. We're not exactly sure because some manuscripts have been later discovered to be parts of other manuscripts, so you drop off one of the numbers. Some manuscripts we discover, oh, we didn't even know about this one before. And CSNTM has discovered over 75 Greek New Testament manuscripts in this century, which is more than all the institutes in the world collectively have discovered. So it's been quite an adventure. 3-week trip to start with, $35,000 we needed to raise, and now we are a going concern, and we are the world's leading institute for digitizing Greek New Testament manuscripts.
That's amazing. So before you started your work, if a scholar wanted to see these ancient these manuscripts, they would have to either travel to those locations and hope they could get in to see it, develop that relationship if it's not in a public library or something, if it was in a monastery or a private library, or there were some facsimiles that were printed. or I guess the earliest things you were trying to replace looked a lot like this microfilm.
That's right. That is the negative of a microfilm, which was produced at the Institute for New Testament Textual Research in Münster, Germany. And they produced the negative because it was easier to read than the positive. So this shows you just how bad it is. And this one was of Charles Ryrie's manuscript, and he brought it to the Institute in Münster in 1989. They photographed it with their microfilm camera. When I got the microfilms, brought them back to Dallas and deposited them at Dallas Seminary, the librarian said, gee, this is a really old microfilm camera. It looks like it's 1930s vintage. And I discovered later that, yes, that's exactly right. Kurt Ahlund, who started the Institute in Münster in 1959, had escaped from East Germany before he was going to go to prison. And he brought with him his old microfilm cameras. And that's what they continued to use up until the last day that they did microfilming.
That is amazing. So the bar got set pretty low, so you could pretty much do no harm with anything you took, including a 4-megapixel camera.
Right, and our goal has always been to make sure that the pictures are easier to read than the actual manuscripts. And of the hundreds of thousands of images that we've taken, I can say that that's true every time, even with those 4-megapixel cameras.
Now, when you say hundreds of thousands of images you've taken, does that include the fact that when a manuscript is digitized, when let's say one leaf is digitized or a folio, there are usually more than a dozen passes, up to 24 passes that are made? Is it counting every one of those images? I mean, could you explain the process there? Because it's not just like take a picture and then turn the page. It's not like that.
Well, it actually is like that, but it's
it is like that.
Far more complex than that. Our cameras cost well, there's 6 figures for the camera, so let's just leave it at that. Yeah, there you go. That's our DT Atom. Terrific camera. And 150 megapixel image is going to be 1 gigabyte in TIFF size. Now, we also have a multispectral imaging camera, and that is what you're thinking of. That takes about 24 pictures of the full range from infrared to ultraviolet. And that's the camera that we use to read manuscripts where what is there on the page is not visible to the naked eye. And so that camera it's really been used to help us with kind of a new renaissance, if you will. We're finding manuscripts that have been right in front of us for centuries, but we couldn't see them simply because we didn't have the equipment to be able to see what was there.
That is amazing. So that includes both seeing nuances in how a scribe would have written and text that has been obscured through some kind of damage or age, or a blackened page or something like that. But sometimes there's underwriting, like a page has been reused to create a palimpsest. And so how have you ever been, surprised that you're looking at a palimpsest? Does it get that obscure, or is it always some kind of blurred undertext that you could recover?
No, sometimes we don't know at all that we have a palimpsest. For example, when we were at a place in England a few months back, I'm one of the persons who prepares the manuscripts for photography. I do the metadata on it, and it's a lot. It's not as bad as it sounds. What it means to prepare a manuscript for photography is just to write up the data, including what the age is. Sometimes there's statements as to when a book was written, how many lines per page, how many pages are in the text. That's the most important task I have, and what the dimensions are. We measure the width, the height, and the depth from between the covers, the bottom of the book and the top of the book. We measure the depth. and almost all manuscripts have a little bit larger depth measuring from the top rather than from the bottom. If it's reversed, that means that the book has probably been stored upside down for most of its life. Because as you well know, you have books in your library, you pull one out, and the others, they have room to breathe on top, but they really don't have the room to breathe on bottom. They just kind of fold, and it's the top part that gets to expand a little bit. So we've looked at manuscripts where the bottom is significantly larger, and it's because they were almost surely stored upside down for well over 500-600 years. Fascinating, those things. So there's a lot of things that I write up on the metadata. And it's in the process of examining these manuscripts that we discover palimpsests. And that's a Greek word that just means scraped again. But I'm impressed with your knowledge. Yeah, that's what it's called, a palimpsest. And we find these. Well, this one, as I mentioned, in England, I didn't see any undertext until about page 73 in this manuscript. And then I saw what looked like the very faint outline of a letter, but I wasn't really sure if it was a letter. It could have been just what happened to the animal skin when they scraped it. You know, the animals have gone through a rough life, and perhaps there was nothing there. So I looked for several more pages, and I began to see that, yes, these were letters on this page, and it's a manuscript that is a palimpsest. The undertext that we didn't know about before. We discovered the oldest palimpsest at the oldest manuscript at the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople in Istanbul. And we didn't have at the time even ultraviolet lights, but we were able to see the undertext because the scribe who wrote on it later, centuries later, didn't do a very good job of scraping off that undertext. And so here we found a manuscript that's somewhere between the 7th and 9th century. And it's fascinating to do this. You can tell sometimes by feel if it's a thinner leaf. Sometimes it might be a little bit rougher than the others because they've had to erase it. And, you know, like if you erase a piece of paper with just a rubber eraser, it's going to feel different than just the regular paper. So those are some of the ways that we discover these palimpsest leaves.
Fascinating. So when you discover a new manuscript, you've mentioned a couple of times the INTF in Münster. What's the process for? They're kind of the scorekeeper, right? They keep the list of all of the accepted, authenticated manuscripts, and they're numbered. They're given an identification number, and that also classifies them if it's a papyri or a minuscule or something like that. And so what's the process after if you say you found one and you give them the information, how long does it take before, I mean, what kind of verification does it go through and how long does it take?
Verification really is not a problem because we don't have very many manuscripts that we would consider to be forgeries. There's at least one that I know of that a few years ago, Münster, which produces the standard scholarly edition of the Greek New Testament, they listed it as a real manuscript. And it was something that was produced in the late 19th century as a copy of a book, of a Greek New Testament that had been published in the 1800s. So that wasn't discovered until a few years ago. And but there were scholars at the time who said, we just don't know if this is a forgery or a real thing. We had questions about it. We discovered a forgery, not of a New Testament manuscript, but of something called, I forgot, the author was supposed to be a man from Jerusalem. I forgot his name offhand, but when we went to this school that had just received it as a gift, they said, it's got a cover letter by the mother of Constantine. And they said that letter is dated to the 4th century. And they thought the manuscript was from the 1st century, 31 leaves. Well, as soon as we saw it, it looked really anomalous. It didn't have any of the characteristics of any manuscript I've ever seen. Immediately I said, well, you're off by at least 1,000 years. This is not an old manuscript at all. it turned out that the parchment was old, but the manuscript itself was probably produced in the 19 teens or 20s. And it was exposed at the University of Chicago back then. And then this manuscript went underground for 60, 70, 80 years, and it showed up at the school. And I think the owners were hoping that nobody would rediscover that this was a forgery. And so when we shot it, we said, you know, this doesn't feel right at all. It's only written on one page, on one side of the page, and all sorts of things were anomalous about it. It didn't have, for example, what's called nomina sacra, or sacred names. There's about 15 of those that we see in almost all the manuscripts, where you have abbreviated words. For example, like God, theos, you'd have a theta and the sigma, and not the two intervening letters, and a horizontal line over the theta and sigma. That horizontal line tells you this is not a word you're reading, but this is an abbreviation for something. And it was a way that Christians revered the scriptures, and they did this with names like God, Lord, Jesus Christ, Father, Spirit, things like that. And this manuscript had none of these. I've never seen any Greek manuscript that would have the standard nomina sacra not to have them written out as abbreviations. So this was clearly a modern invention. And so when we published, we posted a blog about it, James Charlesworth of Princeton Seminary wrote back and said, oh, this is the manuscript that Goodspeed had declared a forgery back in the 1920s, and now it's come to surface again. So, and that was very early on in our history, we discovered that. But,
that's got to be almost as fun as looking at the real thing sometimes.
Oh, I think so. Yeah, it's fun, fun to find out. Back to what Munster does. They will, we don't count a manuscript as discovered until they get photographs of the manuscript, and we send them the metadata, and they go through the process of making sure it's not part of another Greek New Testament manuscript, and making sure that it qualifies as a Greek New Testament manuscript. There was one that we thought was a manuscript of Revelation. It was very late, like 18th century, but it was written in modern Greek. And so I couldn't read it, the language, and the writing was so difficult to figure out. And there was a scholar in Tennessee, Maurice Robinson, who pointed out to me, no, this is not a copy of Revelation. It's a copy of a modern translation of Revelation. So Munster will look at these, and one of the things they do is they look at kind of the fingerprint that we have on the metadata, counting. This is why it's so important to count the leaves, to count the dimensions, give the contents. We actually write up a table of contents for the book. And they find out if it's a part of an already known manuscript or if it's a brand new discovery. One of the manuscripts that we photographed some years back, there was a scholar in North Carolina, and he was working at Duke University. And he said, you know, these four leaves you photographed sure look like this other manuscript that's at Duke. And sure enough, they were a part of that manuscript at Duke. And so we didn't discover anything new, but we did reattach digitally, at least, these images to the ones at Duke. So we have those kinds of things that happen all the time. It's very exciting.
That's what
we don't know exactly what's going to happen.
Well, that's one of the interesting things about your project is you're not only scanning these images, but you're providing the images on the website, and so anybody can go look at them right now. Which means that take Codex Sinaiticus, which is in like 3 different places, it gets gathered together again, and it's the closest way you can see it all in its original form is on it's in a digital format online. Right. And that's one of the beauties of the advantages of having this online database. Plus you can examine it up close all you want without leaving your office and having to travel across, the desert to get to St. Catherine's or something like that.
Right.
So
yeah, that's I think it's a significant thing that we can digitally reassemble, put together these manuscripts again. There are some manuscripts that are in as many as 8 or 9 different locations. It's just been broken up For example, Codex N, a purple codex from the 6th century, is a manuscript that the parchment was dyed purple, and all the letters written on it are written in either silver or gold ink. The gold is used for the nomina sacra, and it was used just for God, Lord, Jesus, and Christ, which tells you that the scribes at that time viewed Jesus as God. In fact, our very earliest manuscripts that mention Jesus or Christ or God or Lord all use nomina sacra. So you can see just from the way the Christians were revering these manuscripts, what their belief system was. So that's an exciting thing when we try to digitally put these manuscripts back together again.
That's fascinating. So you said so this is the 20th anniversary of the center, and you have gone from 4 megapixel cameras to 150 megapixel cameras. So let's say in a perfect world, you get through all of the known extant New Testament manuscripts. Do you start over back where you had the 4 pixels now that you got the 150 and try to up the game on those more, or what happens when you get them all?
Well, you're asking whether we reshoot the ones that we did early on?
Yes.
If we're allowed to, sure. And some of those we are allowed to. Others, no, they don't want us to come back, because these libraries, monasteries, universities, museums, private collections, people are kind of funny about such great treasures. There was a manuscript that we discovered through a friend whom I've never met, but he's in England and he's looking out for manuscripts for us. We've got people all over the world trying to find where some New Testament manuscripts are and then getting us to go there to digitize them. So this guy was in England and he went to Leicester, which is kind of the county seat in part of England, in a rural area. And there was this manuscript on display that was not part of the Leicester City Museum. And he inquired about it, found out that it was owned privately. And he wrote to me and said, if I could find out who owns this, can you come and photograph it? And I said, of course, just give us the information. Let's get in contact with the person. So we found out it was owned by a couple whose house was built in the early 1600s. And it, passed on through the family for centuries. And we got there. I'm not allowed to say where in English it is. It says private collection, England. That's as much as I can tell you. But we got there at 5 in the afternoon because I had been lecturing in London, and then this was out in the country. And they fed us dinner. The two of us got the photography done by 1 in the morning, and the couple left before we got finished. And we got done at, we got up at about 9 a.m. to get back to London for the airport. And they said, you just put the key back in the door when you're done. And I said, you don't know us. Why would you trust us? And they said, look, we know that you did research on us. We also did research on you. And we know that you're honorable and trustworthy people. So that's pretty exciting, but it's also rare. Think of a place that has treasures that they're just, each one of these handwritten manuscripts is a unique production of a scribe copying the word of God. Now, who's going to say, yeah, these are run of the mill? Every one of them is unique. They're all different. It's going to let you come in as a third party and photograph them. It does take sometimes years of correspondence to get that to happen.
Yeah. Have you ever ultimately been turned down?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
We've even been turned down once we had a contract. And we from America to Eastern Europe. And when we got there, they said, no, it's not really in good state of preservation. And that's the most troubling when that kind of thing happens, because we just spent $10,000 to go into Eastern Europe. Now, we were able to photograph another manuscript while there, but we had a contract on this one and they just reneged on it.
Yeah. Wow. So do I take that to mean then does the INTF is one of the criteria that there are photographs of it, of each manuscript on the list?
If today, yes, there were manuscripts that were discovered, some manuscripts in the mid 19th century that have never been photographed. And there's several in Syria, for example. And those are counted because back then photography was pretty new. And the fellow who discovered them didn't have cameras with him. So, and he was one of the best texture critics, if not the best texture critic in the world. So they trust that judgment from earlier ages. But now that you have cameras, they expect to see photographs or it's not going to count as a discovery. We've discovered far more than 75 that we haven't been able to digitize. So but we don't count those.
Amazing. Well, okay, so let's pivot then to the early days of trying to locate the original language, Greek New Testaments, these manuscripts. This basically all started around the time of Constantine Tischendorf, right? When he was began trying to figure out, well, this is when higher criticism was starting to be developed. And so this was the best way. Let's just go find the earliest and best manuscripts and see if we can recover the original text. And this is kind of what kicked off what has led to all of your work, really, hasn't it?
Yeah, in a lot of ways, that's true. Tischendorf traveled throughout the Middle East trying to find monasteries and other sites that had manuscripts. And when he came to St. Catherine's Monastery at the base of Mount Sinai in Egypt in 1843, his first time. And when he was there, what he claims is that the monks were ripping up pages of this big manuscript and tossing them into the fire. Oh yeah, that's a picture of St. Catherine's. Is that my picture, or did you get that from somebody else?
That's not yours. And then here's Tischendorf, who probably wasn't wearing that coat when he went into the middle of Egypt.
Probably not. Yeah, he burned himself out and died at age 59, but he did amazing work. Well, he goes there in 1843, and what he discovers is these leaves from the Old Testament that he claims these monks were ripping out of this big manuscript, the one you're looking at, Codex Sinaiticus, and throwing them into the flames. And he was alarmed at this, and he was able to preserve about 45 leaves of this, and then got those published in Leipzig. Now, that's the way he's told the story, but there's a lot of doubt now about whether Tischendorf is telling the truth. Because first of all, parchment does not burn easily, and this is all animal skin, it's parchment, it's not paper. And not only does it not burn easily, but it yields more smoke than heat, and it's just terrible. So it's unlikely that that's what happened. But I'm not going to get into the issues any more than that, but I've visited St. Catherine's, and I would say that these scribes did not have that kind of an attitude ever in their history. We know of no Christian scribes at any time in history that would consciously destroy books of the Bible, manuscripts of the Bible, unless this is the lone exception, which is hardly likely. This monastery has existed since about AD 535. It's the oldest continually existing monastery in the world. And what they do now is what they did 1,500 years ago. They're just, the life of these monks does not change like in American culture or any other modern society.
And they also have their own program there for digitizing their manuscripts. I believe they have this second largest collection of ancient manuscripts in the world behind the Vatican. Is that correct?
Ancient Greek manuscripts, that's correct.
Yes.
Yeah, and this was found out that they bumped into number 2 starting in 1975, when there was a part of a parchment that was sticking out of one of their mud walls. And the monk pulled it out and found out that it was actually a leaf from this very manuscript, Codex Sinaiticus. And he dug in a little bit further and further. And then he discovered there was a whole storeroom, a geniza, if you will, that had hundreds of manuscripts in there. And so they put a door into this thing. And for the next 24 years, they had scholars come from Athens. They did this as pretty much as a secretive thing about how they were finding parts of Sinaiticus and other manuscripts. And in 1999, they published a catalog of what they had discovered. It ended up being 1,200 manuscripts and over 50,000 fragments of manuscripts. And this included 26 leaves or parts of leaves of Codex Sinaiticus. This is another thing that actually suggests that Tischendorf was wrong, because Tischendorf had parts of First Chronicles and later books of the Old Testament that he brought to Leipzig. But what was discovered in the Geniza were books as early as Joshua. Well, if they were ripping leaves out, they wouldn't just start in the middle of the Old Testament, start ripping things out. They'd start at the beginning. Why would you have books from Joshua and Judges and Ruth and on before you get to Chronicles? Why would you have this kind of stuff? So what is a better hypothesis is that the library, the monastery consolidated all of their manuscripts from 3 different libraries and put them on one side of the library, on one side of the compound. And as they did, there were manuscripts in this particular location where if the manuscript had fallen apart or there were just leaves, what they did with that kind of a thing is they just buried them, just walled it up. And that's what scribes and monks historically do, Christian and Jewish. That's why the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in jars and they were not burned up. That's why we find some papyri next to cemeteries. They were buried. And this is the tradition that Christians and Jews have always had when it comes to scripture. So Tischendorf even hints at this when in his, I'm telling you stuff that is really not known because not very many people have seen Tischendorf's second edition of his Greek New Testament that he gave to St. Catherine's Monastery. I was allowed to photograph it. I think it's the only photograph that we have of it. And he wrote a note in the front where he said, I am giving this in hopes of it being useful for the new library. It's either the word new or common library. You have the word between koine and kaine. And so you've got, well, which is it? And that's the tricky thing. But either way, it looks like during Tischendorf's time, they were moving books into a common library, which would also be their new library. And that explains why you have all these manuscripts that had just been buried for 150 years before they were discovered. That's pretty exciting. That's when they found St. Catherine's moved up to second place in terms of Greek manuscripts, where they now have 3,300 Greek manuscripts of all sorts at the monastery.
Amazing. And I believe they have their own camera for digitizing that was provided by Prince Charles.
Yes.
Is that correct? And they're in the midst of that, but there's just way more work to be done than they're able to do. And so you've come alongside them. Yeah. What an incredible opportunity. That librarian there, yes, he's from Texas, right?
Yeah, right. First American ever to be the librarian and one of the few non-Greeks to ever be a monk there.
Amazing. So did he speak highly of Tischendorf or not so much?
I don't know that we discussed Tischendorf. I was there for 6 or 7 days. But I don't think we talked. Well, maybe we did. And of course, the position of the monastery is that Tischendorf didn't pull Sinaiticus out in the most ethical way. And, he said he wanted to borrow it, get it photographed in St. Petersburg. He was, for this third trip, 1859, he took it to Cairo, had 2 other fellows help transcribe it. Then he took it to Russia to have it photographed. And the Tsar said, I'm not sending it back. This is my manuscript now, meaning Russia's manuscript. And so I don't think Tischendorf was real excited to bring it back to the monks anyway, but he could have complained about that. But nevertheless, it ended up in Russia's hands and they sold it to the British Library after the Great Depression started. So that's why the New Testament of Codex Sinaiticus is now in the British Library in London.
What makes it so important is that it is the oldest extant complete New Testament that we have.
Exactly. Yeah. Middle of the 4th century, about 350, 500
Yeah.
years older than the next complete New Testament that we have.
Amazing, amazing. Well, okay, so let's talk about a couple of the other important finds then. One of them would be this one, the famous P52. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the significance of this?
Yeah, this is a manuscript that actually is about the size of a credit card. And in 1920, Manchester University got some papyrus fragments that Frederick Kenyon, who later became the curator of the British Library, was looking at and decoding. By 1934, he had retired from that post, and a man named Colin H. Roberts came to Manchester University and was working in the John Rylands Library. And Kenyon had left some papyrus scraps, I believe, in a shoebox. And one of the first ones that Roberts found was this scrap. Now, as he looked at it, he said, wow, this is interesting. There's writing on both sides. And that was rare because books at the time, up until the second half of the 1st century, virtually all books were written on a scroll or a roll. And they would be written on the inside of the papyrus, because that's where you'd have the horizontal lines and you could put the letters on it. This was written on the horizontal lines, which you see on the left side there, and on the vertical lines, the back side of it. And as he deciphered it, he discovered this is John chapter 18, verses 31 through 33 in the front, and John 18, verses 37 and 38 on the back side. Well, that told him that this manuscript came from a codex. A codex is our modern form of book that's, cut on 3 sides and bound on one side, and you turn pages. Roberts actually later literally wrote the book on the birth of the codex. That was the title of the book. And he was one of these great Egyptologists who was discovering when the codex would have been invented. And as far as we can tell, it was invented in the late 1st century. But almost no one used it except Christians for a long, long time afterwards. In fact, in the first 5 centuries of the Christian era, over 90% of Christian books were written on a codex, and less than 15% of non-Christian books were written on a codex. They were written on a scroll. So this is the first, and I think the only time in Christian history where Christians were ahead of the technological curve.
All right, great. Let me show you one other and get a story out of you, and then we'll talk about some textual criticism. Here is a very famous palimpsest, as we were talking about palimpsest earlier. So can you tell us a little bit about this one?
I believe that's Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus, Codex C. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. I've seen the thing in real life at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And the blue dye you see there is chemical reagents that were applied to the entire manuscript to bring up the undertext. This was a palimpsest. It is a palimpsest written in the early 5th century, so the early 400s. And what was written on top was something else written hundreds of years later. Now, as you can see, what was written later was in 2 columns. And this particular manuscript was only single column back from the 5th century. So they could read some of the letters before they even could do the chemical reagents. Well, that was applied in the 1830s. And it just so happened that Constantine Tischendorf, when he visited Paris before his trip to St. Catherine's Monastery, before that trip, he saw this manuscript, and he spent 2 years deciphering that undertext. It took him 2 years to read over 150 leaves or 300 pages, painstaking work and brilliant eyesight to get this done. And that really started his career. This manuscript is our second most important manuscript of the book of Revelation. It originally had the whole Bible in it. And what's really interesting about it, I mean, there's a lot of things that are interesting, but one of the interesting things is that when it gets to Revelation chapter 13, verse 18, it says the number of the beast is not 666, but 616. And I've had a chance to look at that very page. In fact, Tischendorf wrote out in the front of the manuscript the table of contents. You do that today and you'd still be in jail for defacing an old manuscript, but he did that back then.
Amazing. Okay, so it's one thing to preserve all of these manuscripts. It's another thing to use them as tools for recovering the original texts that these were copies of, that these purport to be copies of, or they're copies of copies. But we don't have any of the originals, any of the original writings from the New Testament. How long do you think the originals actually lasted?
Well, there's been some recent pushback on this, but most scholars, and I would agree with the consensus, is that all of them would have disappeared before AD 200. And the reason they would have disappeared, papyrus actually can last a long time. And there was a fellow who wrote about Roman libraries. And he said that in a lot of these libraries where you have the papyri, they would last for several centuries. The New Testament, however, is different. Because it was the lifeblood of the church, people were copying it and reading it and copying it and reading it much more frequently than they would any other kind of literature. And just by the process of doing that, these manuscripts would have worn out and turned to dust within 100, 150 years.
Yeah, but one of the things that one of the misconceptions about making copies of them is a lot of times we think of you make a copy off the original and then other copies are made off that copy, and we forget about the existence of the first copy. So the first copy, the actual original, would have been the source for copies for up to 150 years or so, up to the end of the second century possibly.
Oh, yeah.
So that means like a first generation copy could possibly, I'm not saying it was, but in theory, it could possibly have been the source itself for something like Codex Sinaiticus. And so then, even though we're saying it's mid 4th century, it sounds like a long ways away from the original, and it might be, but it's not necessarily.
Correct. And when you compare these manuscripts with others, Westcott and Hort famously in their publication in 1881 argued that when you have Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus in agreement with each other, that's another 4th century New Testament and Old Testament manuscript at the Vatican. And I think it's the most important New Testament manuscript in the world. When those two agree, they said this goes back several generations. And their argument was that we're talking about a 2nd century origin for what these two manuscripts share in common. And we know that the Alexandrian copying, which these two are called Alexandrian manuscripts, they either came from Egypt or they follow the patterns of what were done in Egypt. And we know that the copying in Alexandria was the world's leading institute for making very careful copies. And so we have careful copies of careful copies of careful copies going back to the original, found to a large degree in these Alexandrian witnesses, and we have quite a few of them. But when Olaf or Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus agree, and then you throw in an early papyrus that may be 150 years older than either of those, that's pretty hard to argue against that being original.
Okay, so
let me just compare this to the average classical Greek or Roman author, if I may. We're waiting 500 to 1,000 years before we get any copies from the average Greco-Roman author. By 500 years out for the New Testament, we already have well over 150 copies. So you have the New Testament duplicated several times before 500 years out, and the average classical Greek or Roman author, 15 copies maybe only 5, 10. New Testament, we have 5,500 or so in Greek, and then another 15 to 20,000 in other languages. You stack that up, and we're talking about over 1.25 miles high of manuscripts compared to a classical author where the stack of all his copies, it reaches the height of a podium versus 1.25 miles.
Amazing. But one of the interesting things about it is within those 5,500 or so, no two of them agree exactly. So how many, so each time there's a disagreement, you have a variant, a textual variant. So how many variants are there, and how many of them affect our ability to recover the original text?
In 1713, a man by the name of Richard Bentley, working at Cambridge University, wrote a book defending a volume that had come out 6 years earlier in 1707 by John Mill. Mill was an Oxford scholar, and he spent his entire adult life looking at manuscripts, as many as he could find. He discovered 99, or worked with 99 Greek manuscripts, ancient translations in Syriac and Latin and Coptic and other languages, and church fathers' writings where they're quoting from the New Testament. So he spends about 30 years on this, gets it published, and he publishes as his text the Textus Receptus, pretty much the Greek text that stands behind the King James Bible. But then he has an apparatus or footnotes that are about 3/4 of every page with the variants, the differences among these. And another scholar counted out how many differences there were, how many variants. He came up with 30,000 differences. Now, a little bit later in the 1700s, a man by the name of Johann Albrecht Bengel wrote a very significant point. He looked at all of these 30,000 variants, and he said not a single cardinal doctrine is affected by any of these variants. And so Bengel argued for the orthodoxy of the variants. Since that time, we've found a whole lot more than 99 manuscripts. And if you count all the differences, right down to the spelling differences, things that don't matter, that can't even be translated, we have about 1.5 million variants. And yet still, to this day, we can say there's not a single cardinal doctrine that is in any way affected by any of these variants. Even Bart Ehrman, in his Misquoting Jesus in the paperback edition, on page 252 says, yeah, no cardinal doctrine is in any jeopardy by these variants.
Amazing. So that would be about, I've heard you actually quantify it as about 99.8% of the variants don't affect anything. You're talking about 1/5 of 1% of the text where the original is not known with a fair degree of certainty.
And actually, that's a very generous estimate. It's really probably a lot lower than that, but I'm saying, yeah, as much as 1/5 of 1% of all the texture variants.
Amazing. So that's about 400 words in the Greek text?
Well, no, it would be, they're not necessarily just words. It could be long passages. There's 2 long passages. Mark 16, verses 9 through 20. Those verses are not found in Sinaiticus or Vaticanus. The wording doesn't sound like Mark. It's an abrupt change where Mary Magdalene is reintroduced after she was just mentioned. All sorts of things just don't look like it's by Mark. And even early church fathers say we only find this in very, very few manuscripts. And yet it's found in almost all of them that were done after the 4th century. And then you've got the other long passage. There's only 2 variants that are longer than 2 verses, and maybe about 15 that are 1 or 2 verses. That's it for all 138,162 words in the Greek New Testament. There's about 15 places where 1 or 2 verses might be affected. And the other long passage, though, is John 7:53 through 8:11, the story of the woman caught in adultery. I would say that's my favorite passage that's not in the Bible. It's one that we all would like to have. And if you had to choose between the long ending of Mark's gospel or the story of the woman caught in adultery, if you could say, I want one of these to be in the Bible and one to be out, hands down, the woman caught in adultery stays in, picking up snakes, drinking poison, speaking in weird languages. You know, that one goes out. That in terms of our emotional baggage, but in terms of the evidence, the case against the story of the woman caught in adultery is significantly stronger than the case against Mark 16, the long ending. And yet that case is, I think, almost airtight. So both of these passages, we have to bow to history. And that's one of the key issues of the Christian life. We don't base our faith on emotions. We base it on the facts, on historical evidence. The scripture subjects itself to historical investigation, just as the incarnation of the God-man, Jesus Christ, subjected himself to historical verification. That's why the tomb, the stone was rolled back, not to let Jesus out, but to let the disciples come in and see that he was no longer there. That's historical verification.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. I know we got to wrap it up, but I want to show just a quick little chart I threw together that kind of shows the principles of doing textual criticism in order to, when you're doing comparison of textual variants, how all the things that are considered in order to recognize what the original might be. And no one of these trumps the other, but they kind of all work in tension to create kind of a web to catch the meaning ultimately. Anything missing from the chart that you might want to add there? I mean, I know we don't have time to work through each of these things, but for those wondering, how are you going to choose?
Yeah, this looks almost like
this is it.
Satanic chart. Is that what this is? That's the first thing that jumped out at me.
It's 6 points. It's 6 points.
So it's a simple way to represent it, but I would say the majority of types, that category is one that I was taught in college, and I would say, no, that's probably not a valid category. But when you think about the best type, instead of using the word type, it's better to use textual cluster, or a cluster of manuscripts, where you've got a number of manuscripts that largely agree with each other much of the time. They belong to a textual cluster. So I would use that. Okay. And you've got oldest versus majority. Those are two competing methods of dealing with the text of the New Testament, but they're different methods. One really counts noses, and it comes up with all sorts of sophisticated arguments as to why that is the right way to do textual criticism. And the other says, all other things being equal, the oldest manuscripts will preserve the original better than later manuscripts. But there's many exceptions. The shortest wording, that category is an internal category of between two different variants. The shorter one is probably original. That's been challenged in recent years, but I think it's still a fairly valid category, but it's not always valid. And the person who came up with this in the 18th century gave all sorts of reasons as to when it would not be valid. For example, if a scribe accidentally deletes something, that'll be the shorter reading, but that doesn't make it better. But if it's shorter because scribes would be prone to add something, especially as clarification, then it's a really valid principle. And your other one, which is internal, is the most difficult. The more difficult reading is more likely to be original, all other things being equal. If it's too difficult so that it's almost nonsense, then scholars say, no, there was just some kind of jumbling that happened some time ago. But if it's more difficult than the other, in terms of how it fits sometimes into the Christian faith, that can be some troubling things for us. I'm going to give one example. In Mark 1:41, the vast majority of manuscripts, all the Greek manuscripts except for one, say that when the leper came to Jesus and asked him, if you're willing, you can heal me. Jesus says, it says in the text that he felt compassion and he said, I am willing, and he heals him. There's one Greek manuscript that really is an outlier, but it has a very ancient text, and it says Jesus did not have compassion, but angered. He said, I am willing. And I think that that's the original wording of what we have in Mark 1:41. Now, it's a far more difficult reading. People would far rather have a compassionate Jesus than an angry Jesus. And what's really interesting is that Matthew and Luke, that I believe copied or used Mark extensively, when they speak of a compassionate Jesus, they don't do it unless Mark says it. They don't do it on their own. And so here you have Matthew and Luke saying nothing. If Mark 141 said that Jesus was compassionate, why is it that both Matthew and Luke that have parallel passages don't call him compassionate? It can't be explained. There's other reasons that I would argue for that, but the more difficult reading, I think, in this case, is the original.
Well, thank you for helping just do a quick overview of the factors that get considered when you're sorting through variants in order to recognize the original reading. So, okay, so I don't want to take up any more of your time. You've been incredibly generous to do this, and I will stop pestering you to do a podcast with me. But I do want to.
One other thing, Doug.
Oh, absolutely.
You might want to cut out. I don't know. It depends on when this is going to air, but
no.
It's not airing right now, is it?
No, it's not.
I thought, oops. We're having our 20th anniversary celebration on September 10th. And we just got $100,000 grant. It's a matching grant. So we need to come up with $100,000 to reach that. So we'll have 200,000. And we have some expeditions to Europe, Germany, and the UK coming up if we can raise $250,000. So right now, for every dollar that somebody wants to send in, we're tax deductible. So any donations would be credited to your account tax-wise. And for every dollar that comes in, it's equal to 2. It's a great time to help the center to do its mission of finding more manuscripts, digitizing them, and sharing with the world for free and forever.
Well, that was the plug I wanted to make, is to go to csntm.org and please support their work, because it is incredibly important, and it will benefit people for generations, believers for generations. And it's rare to find something that has that kind of long-lasting impact that you can contribute to, but this is it. And right now it's double your money if you give, so that's even better. So all right. Well, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. I sure appreciate it. And I especially appreciate all of your work. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Doug. Thank you for writing the books that you're writing and thinking of us when you're doing it.
Oh, yeah. Well, there's my plug. So there's 2 of the books that are out so far. If you get them through the publisher, part of the proceeds actually go to the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. So you can contribute that way too. But your money to this work goes further if you give it straight to them right now, because it gives double. So, all right. Thank you.
Pleasure talking to you.